It's alive! Actually, they never said that in the Hammer Frankenstein movie, so that's not a very good intro.
It's alive! It's alive!
How's it going, everyone? Welcome again to the Cobweb channel. My name is Daniel, and today I'm going to be ranking all 7 Hammer Frankenstein films. I just got done with a review series reviewing all of the Hammer Frankenstein movies starring Peter Cushing, and today we're going to talk about all 7, rank them from worst to best. These films were released from 1957 all the way to 1974. But what's my personal preference? Leave yours in the comments down below. I would love to see how you rank the Hammer Frankenstein movies. And without further ado, let's conduct this experiment. Dead last at number 7, we've got Horror of Frankenstein from 1970. This is a weird outlier in the series, and the only one that I didn't review as part of my review series because I hate it and I didn't really want to talk about it, but we're going to talk about it here. This is a reboot of the original Frankenstein film, and it's the only one that doesn't star Peter Cushing in the title role. They decided to get rid of Peter Cushing, reboot with a young new actor. Ralph Bates plays Dr. Victor Frankenstein here. At this time, Hammer was trying to set up Ralph Bates as their new big star. It never really took off, but here's an example of him getting to play the lead role. And while Dr. Frankenstein has always been evil in this series, this is a movie where I think they took it too far. And Ralph Bates as Dr. Frankenstein is so reprehensible, so unlikable, that it's almost unbearable to watch.
He stinks and I don't like him.
The biggest problem, I think, is he doesn't have the charisma of Peter Cushing, where even when Peter Cushing is playing a horrible person, you still got that charisma there, that Peter Cushing energy that you love to watch. Ralph Bates doesn't have that, so when he's unlikable, you just want to punch him in the face every single time he's on screen. Veronica Carlson is here playing Elizabeth, and she is treated so horribly through this whole film. She's in love with Dr. Frankenstein. He does not love her back. He treats her like garbage through the whole movie, and that's also pretty difficult to watch. And on top of all of this unpleasantness, the movie was actually trying to be a bit of a comedy, a bit of a spoof, and it's not funny. It doesn't work for me. Ending of this movie is so anticlimactic because they're kind of trying to make it funny, and it just makes the movie feel lame. And David Prowse is the Frankenstein monster in this. You do get kind of a traditional Frankenstein monster design with the flat top head, but something about him too, he just looks lame. Not monstrous enough, just a pale guy with a flat head. At number 6, The Evil of Frankenstein from 1964. Another outlier in the series because this is the only one of the Peter Cushing Frankenstein films that was not directed by Terence Fisher. This one is directed by Freddie Francis, and this is another example of them rebooting the series. Already with the 3rd film in the series, they rebooted the continuity because they got to work with Universal. The first 2 Hammer Frankenstein movies were totally separate from Universal, so they weren't allowed to use any of the classic Universal Frankenstein iconography, the lightning, the flat-topped monster, all of that stuff had to be gone. Now that they're working with Universal, they had the rights to use all those things. So it's essentially Hammer's tribute to the Universal Frankenstein series. And instead of being different and interesting like most of the Hammer Frankenstein movies are, this one just feels like a cheap, crappy knockoff of the Universal films. The resurrection scene is this long flashback that's really, really boring. The monster is a really pathetic attempt to look like Boris Karloff. Yeah, he's green and he's got the flat top, but he looks like paper mache. I mean, it's some of the cheapest practical special effects I think I've ever seen. Peter Cushing is here as Dr. Frankenstein, and that's nice to see, but it also feels like his character just gets a little bit lost. He just feels like kind of lame, and like he doesn't have a lot of purpose in this story, because while this is called The Evil of Frankenstein, it's much more the evil of Zoltan, who is a evil hypnotist in this movie, who hypnotizes the monster into doing his evil bidding, and the movie becomes kind of more about him, which is a weird choice. And kicking off the top 5, Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed from 1969.
I beg your pardon, I thought you knew what you were talking about.
Now, I know I'm ruffling feathers with this placement because I know a lot of people love Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed, and it's hard for me to argue with you because it does have great production design. It's a beautiful movie. It's got, in many ways, a very good script with some very good dialogue, but this is the 5th film in the series, and when I'm watching these movies, I get really invested in Peter Cushing's character of Dr. Frankenstein, and I felt like he was going through kind of an arc, becoming a less evil character and more of an anti-hero, and Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed pulls all of his character development away, really resets him back to zero to be a sadist. He'd always been kind of an evil character, a character who would do bad things to get his experiments done. And in this movie, he's just a horrific monster who wants to hurt people. And that almost feels first and foremost. His assistant in this movie is not a willing assistant like in most most movies, he's somebody he's blackmailing. He treats the assistant's fiance, played by Veronica Carlson, again, like garbage. This series treats Veronica Carlson horribly, including an SA scene, which I'm going to say in order to keep things clean, that is horrifically out of character, terrible to watch, and doesn't fit in the movie at all. It has like no bearing on it, really just to add more exploitation sleaze into the movie when it really didn't need that. And to top off all of the unpleasantness in this movie, there is a lot of unpleasantness. They also shoehorned in a comedy subplot about an inspector investigating things that we already know the answers to throw in some laughs. It feels like it's got so much studio interference that really held the movie back. And in the first few movies, we had been watching Dr. Frankenstein's experiments advance, get more and more outlandish, frankly, and crazy. And this movie is the simplest Frankenstein experiment of all of the movies. It is a brain transplant. That is it. There's not even any reviving of the dead. A brain transplant, that's all you're going to get. For all of these reasons, this movie is lacking for me, despite the fact that in several ways it is well made, and truly Peter Cushing does his best. I don't like the character here, but he does a phenomenal job with it. At number 4, Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell from 1974. This is the last movie in the series and the only one I don't own on physical media. I need to get that Scream Factory Blu-ray, but I am a big fan of this movie. It's very different. It takes us into a new setting of an insane asylum where a Frankenstein fanboy, a guy who's trying to continue the experiments of Dr. Frankenstein, gets sentenced to for his crimes of grave robbing and trying to revive the dead. And in that insane asylum, he finds Dr. Frankenstein, who was also condemned there, but is now working as the head doctor because he was able to blackmail the very sleazy director who runs the place. From there, the movie becomes this very interesting film of a protege and Dr. Frankenstein continuing his experiments and trying to rebuild and improve a person that Frankenstein had revived from the dead. And unfortunately, the monster looks like this. He looks like this giant ape man. It does not work at all. It's not a good effect. It doesn't make sense because he is just supposed to be a guy that Frankenstein revived, and he does not look like a human being at all. I mean, I respect that they were going back to trying to make the monster monstrous, which they hadn't really done in the Peter Cushing series since Evil of Frankenstein, but the effect, even when played by David Prowse, just doesn't work. But all that being the case, I like that this movie gives us back the character of Dr. Frankenstein that had been building over the series, that Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed took away from us. Peter Cushing is great, and it is by far the goriest movie in the series, which you gotta respect. At number 3, The Revenge of Frankenstein from 1958. This is the second film in the series and is a direct continuation of Hammer's first Frankenstein film. And of all the sequels Hammer ever made, and they did make a lot, this one's probably the best at being a direct continuation, at picking up right where the last movie left off and moving the story forward in a lot of interesting directions. I really like how the experiment is moved forward in this movie, because of course Frankenstein always wanted to make a perfect specimen of a human man, create him. And it didn't work in the first movie. Of course, he created a horrific monster, but here he's able to be more successful. He does build a handsome, perfect body, and he is able to get a willing brain donor. So he's even trying to be a little bit more ethical about it this time with a physically disabled man who wants to have a perfect body. It's cool to see Frankenstein actually be able to be successful this time for a little while. Of course, things do end up going wrong. Of course, things deteriorate. Of course, things lead to cannibalism. What? Okay, that's not exactly an of course, but they do, and that's pretty cool. Now, the monster here is played by Michael Gwynn, who's phenomenal in this movie. He really just drains every bit of sympathy we can possibly have for a Frankenstein monster onto him. Love him in this film. And the token romance that practically every gothic horror film had during this time is between the monster and Sylvia Trench, the actress who plays Sylvia Trench in the early James Bond movies, which is cool to see. And that is a darn cool, transgressive way to do a romance in an old classic horror movie. The movie is so well done, so visually beautiful, such a great script, so much great dialogue, and I love Francis Matthews as Dr. Frankenstein's very willing assistant who forms a great friendship with Dr. Frankenstein throughout this film. At number 2, Frankenstein Created Woman from 1967, the fourth film in the series, and after Evil of Frankenstein rebooted rebooted things, it really feels like Frankenstein Created Woman gets us back on track. It feels like the Hammer Frankenstein universe again, not a cheap Universal Frankenstein universe. This is another movie that really moves the experiment forward, because this time Frankenstein is dealing with the soul, the transference of the soul, trying to trap the soul after it leaves a dead body and put it into another body. It's really crazy. This is probably the weirdest of all of the films in the series. I love it. I love the audacity of this movie. But where the movie really shines is actually with the young lovers plot. Like I said, like every gothic horror film, they got a token romance, but it's almost never as interesting as it is here between a young man and a woman who has a huge scar on her face. It's sort of a forbidden romance because the father's not supportive of it, and everybody makes fun of this woman for being ugly, even though she's played by Susan Denberg, so no matter what, she's going to be gorgeous. And unfortunately, their story takes really tragic turns, and the movie turns into a very, very satisfying revenge movie, all helped out by Dr. Frankenstein bringing people back from the dead, possibly all into the same body. Yeah, this is a weird movie, and I love it. And this is the movie where I feel like Dr. Frankenstein had really reached anti-hero status, no longer feels like a villain, still an amoral character, but one you absolutely root for. This is probably one of Peter Cushing's best performances in the series. Love him in this.
I am a doctor.
Of medicine?
Of medicine, law, and physics.
And of witchcraft.
To the best of my knowledge, doctorates are not awarded for witchcraft. But if ever they are, no doubt I shall qualify for one.
But at number one, the original The Curse of Frankenstein from 1957. Yeah, this is the first film in the series, but it's also the first in Hammer's entire run of color gothic films. One of my favorite runs of horror films of all time. I love that this movie kicked things off, and it is to date my favorite Hammer film and one of my favorite movies of all time. Like I mentioned before, Hammer did not have any involvement from Universal, and as a result, they did not have permission to utilize any of the classic iconography that Universal created for the Frankenstein story. They could only use the book as a reference, and even so, the movie's nothing like the book. It's probably even less like the book than the Universal film is, which already isn't much. But Peter Cushing, in his first starring role in a movie, gives one of the best performances I've ever seen in a horror film.
I can't prove you murdered, but I can stop you using his brain.
Why? He has no further use for it?
This is like the perfect balance of evil Dr. Frankenstein and anti-hero Dr. Frankenstein who we like to root for, even though we know he's a bad guy. This movie's got the best balance of the bunch and the best monster, because you've got Christopher Lee also kicking off his Hammer debut in this film as the monster, a much less interesting version of the monster than Boris Karloff was, definitely less of a character and with a way less iconic design. But I like that he feels so different in that he's like a wounded animal. Less of a man, but more this sad, pathetic thing that you just know Dr. Frankenstein should not have revived this thing. This is sad. And the design is, like I said, less iconic, but frightening. There's a good conflict in this movie between Dr. Frankenstein and his old mentor, Paul, who's trying to stop him in these ungodly experiments. And it's just awesome. It's the perfect color gothic Hammer film, and it's my favorite of the Hammer Frankenstein series. So that's my list, and that concludes my Hammer Frankenstein series. But if you haven't yet, please let me know your ranking down in the comments below. Thank you so much for coming with me on this journey to talk about all these Hammer Frankenstein films. But the playlist is right over here if you missed any of the reviews and you want more in-depth thoughts on any of these movies. And make sure you subscribe, because I'm definitely gonna have more gothic horror reviews on the way. Thank you so much for watching. With all that said, don't forget to enjoy yourself today, have some fun, and I'll see you next time.